would like to dedicate my words today to the memory of Samir Flores Soberanes, a Mexican activist, murdered some days ago after campaigning against the the construction of a new gas pipeline in Amilcingo, Morelos. I hope that my words honor properly Samir's legacy as a guardian of the earth hearts, un guardián del corazón de la tierra. So, let me start. In this presentation, points of departure matter. In Undoing Colonial Patriarchies, Life and Struggles Pathways, Mexican anthropologist Xochitl Leiva tells us the following. The starting points that we select have a strong imprint that is not only symbolic, but also concrete and practical on what we do, think and feel, and above all, in how we do, think and feel it. The starting points intersect with the place of enunciation, but cannot be reduced to it. Now, let me share one of my points of departure. So these are the words of Lenca indigenous leader Berta Cáceres, as probably you know, when she accepted the Goldman Environmental Award in 2015. Berta lidered COPIN's struggle, the Honduras-based Consejo Cívico de Organizaciones Populares e Indígenas, against the world's largest dam construction, Aguasarca Dam, in the Hualcarque River. Sadly, some days after the award ceremony, some months after the award ceremony, Berta was assassinated by members of the private security forces of TESA, the local owner and developer of the project. For some of us, Berta Cáceres' struggle, like many other experiences of resistance to coloniality's violence, over racialized and dehumanized bodies, lives, territories, memories, are vivid realizations of plural beings, resisting and of their embodied knowledges, challenging developmentalist agendas. Inspired by Berta Cáceres' own struggle and by her daughter's invitation not to forget her mother's struggle formulated to all ISS community where I'm based in 2016, I would like to invite you all to follow me on a decolonial reading of development as a discourse belonging to modernity, hence to the genealogy of the dominant West. My aim is to present some elements of this reading as an effort to better understand development as an articulation of the modern colonial divide. Since 2008, I'm part of a group of indigenous, Afro-descendant, and Mestiza academics activists, conducting collaborative research, writing, and teaching practices on the knowledges that are co-created by communities resisting violent forms of power, destroying land, women's lives, and hope in the Apia land, the Americas. We have documented and disseminated our findings in books and academic publications, via teaching tours, and even with the creation of an autonomous publishing house, Editorial Retos. But most importantly, we have been reflecting together about the learnings that emerge from defending rivers, mountains, lands, and our intimate relationships with Earth. We are called the Transnational Network Other Knowledges, Retos. For some of us who are based in academia, to learn and teach about our relation to Earth has meant to unlearn our modern colonial subjectivities, ways of working and relations to learning. Some of us are not taking for granted anymore categories such as women, men, and of course, gender and research. Fortunately, we have been doing this unlearning hosted by the Universidad de la Tierra, the Land University, Unitierra, in the south of Mexico. Unitierra is a university for and by indigenous communities of the central valleys of Oaxaca and of Chiapas, Zapatistas territories in the south of Mexico. But Unitierra is a university otherwise, in the sense that it is a de-scholarized and de-professionalized center for convivial learning. Therefore, at Unitierra, you won't find teachers or professors, or professions, or disciplines, but conviviality as a political praxis. In Unitierra, Zapoteco, Mije, and Maya, in their different variants, are spoken. Spanish, my mother and colonial tongue, is just one of the many languages spoken there. So the ideas you are going to listen today emerge from these encounters, including the following question. Can development respond to the possibility of an ethical life that is not structurally implicated with the suffering and the consumption of life, of Earth and others? In addressing this question, I would like to share the ideas I have been developing and writing about with Rolando Vázquez. Let me start with the basic proposition of decolonial thinking, which acknowledges that there is no modernity without coloniality. Hence, there is no narrative of development without its coloniality. From this starting point, modern development cannot be thought, sensed, and experienced without its underside, without the processes of exclusion, destitution, and extraction that accompany it. Here it's important to emphasize that from a decolonial perspective, the entanglements of power as expressed in binaries that to this day shape realities are acknowledged, such as civilized, uncivilized, developed, undeveloped, democratic, undemocratic, north-south, and so on. But we don't think, act, sense through these binaries, but through an active engagement with modernity as coloniality. Coloniality as the underside of modernity constitutes then an epistemic location from which reality is thought and sensed. This locus of enunciation following Walter Mignolo means that hegemonic histories of modernity as a product of the Renaissance or the Industrial Revolution are not accepted but challenged to undo their Eurocentric power projection inherent to them. Precisely in seeking to avoid becoming just another hegemonic project, decolonial thinking is also understood as an option, in contrast to paradigms or grand theories among a plurality of many other options. Early writings on modernity coloniality understood it as a co-constitutive binomial and a structure of management that operates by controlling the economy, authority, government and politics, of course, knowledge, subjectivities, gender, sexuality. From this perspective, the coloniality of power explains that basic and universal social classification of the population of the planet in terms of the idea of race is introduced for the first time with the conquest of the Americas, according to Aníbal Quijano. This analysis has displayed, according to many decolonial thinkers, the heterogeneous and transversal character of the modern colonial system, counterpoising racial domination to Eurocentric Marxist theories of class exploitation, for example. More recently, it has been argued that modernity coloniality as the binomial around which gravitates decolonial thinking and praxis has as a departure point the acknowledgement of the limits and exteriority of modernity. This is to mark a contrast with the thinking center in the Western philosophical tradition, in which modernity in its different facets, unfinished, plural, hybrid, postmodern, globalization, capitalism, you name it, is assumed as the totality of reality. Rolando Vázquez explained in the text Colonialidad y Relacionalidad, or Coloniality and Relationality, that for decolonial thinking, modernity with its modernities cannot claim to cover all the historical reality. There is an outside, something beyond modernity, because there are ways of relating to the world, ways of feeling, acting, and thinking, ways of living and inhabiting the world that come from other geogenealogies, non-Western and non-modern. From this perspective, to be conscious about modernity's underside, coloniality, grants a decolonial perspective to one's own perspective, which becomes a thinking and a sensing situated in the exteriority of modernity. So you might be wondering, what does all this imply for the way we think, practice, sense development? My task today is to share with you some tentative decolonial directions around this question. The overall idea is that from a decolonial perspective, praxis, sensing, the analysis of development, human, sustainable, green, critical, or alternative, cannot be done without unpacking its ethnocentrism, anthropocentrism, and epistemic violence as a monocultural and hegemonic project of domination and of erasure of the vast plurality of the world. It is, of course, important to acknowledge previous efforts in critical development studies informed by critical feminism, post-development and post-colonial analytical frameworks dealing with the task of decolonizing development. But from a decolonial perspective, we propose to explore development in two specific dimensions. First, as a mediation between the global north and the global south, and as an articulation of modernity's movement of representation and appropriation. Precisely these two movements, representation and appropriation, allow us to address the task of decolonizing development by analyzing how it functions as an articulation of the modern colonial divide along two axes. A, the mediation towards the social majorities of the world, and B, the mediation towards Earth. Let me explain this further. Development is demarcated by a negative relation to Earth, which is reduced to nature as an alterity, and in a negative relation to the social majorities of the world, reduced to a category of poor as an alterity. These two axes of differentiation and domination are suggested as questioning guides toward a decolonial critique of development. So, this is the outline of what I'm going to do in the rest of my time. We have already covered two of them. But let me just go back a little bit to the second point on modernity, coloniality, and decoloniality. I have already explained some important elements regarding decolonial thinking. Let me now reiterate two of them and bring some examples. One, coloniality as a co-constitutive element of the Western model of civilization opened a field of investigation not simply focused on how modernity established itself, and this is very important, but also on the processes of negation that it implied. Second point, early writings on modernity, coloniality, mainly by Aníbal Quijano, understood it as a co-constitutive duality and a matrix of power that operates by controlling the economy, authority, knowledge, subjectivities, gender, and sexuality. But more recently, modernity and coloniality have been understood as co-implicated, but also as designating two different movements towards world historical reality. Modernity as the historical movement of power, naming and representing reality, then appropriating worlds of meaning. For example, non-Europeans were named uncivilized in the colonial encounter, and since 1950s, as we know, a group of countries were named underdeveloped, as they did not conform to the norm. Meanwhile, coloniality is a movement in which the erasure of knowing systems outside or in the margins of human rationality or our parameters of intelligibility, for example, the sacred relationship of the Walcarque River for Lenca people, takes place. Let me dig into those two elements now. Development as mediation. What do we mean by development as mediation? Well, that development cannot be separated from the history of Western modernity. Development has functioned at one and at the same time as representation and articulation of the modern colonial divide. By the modern colonial divide, I mean the division between the human and the savage, between civilization and nature, that lingers behind the notion of development. Development belongs to the epistemic tradition of the West that has arrogated to itself the authority to classify the diversity of the earth as nature and the diversity of peoples of the world as others. The image that you are looking at this, in this moment is from the visual artist Pedro Lash, who in this map merges English, Spanish, and French, all colonial languages, to produce a new cartography based on the meanings of the word Indian and indigenous. For the purposes of this presentation, this cartography allows me to disrupt development, Eurocentric and anthropocentric epistemology whose identity as a geographical center and historical contemporaneity of humanity depended on the externalization of Earth and of the peoples of the world as otherness, as I have already mentioned. Development as an expression of this genealogy of an anthropocentric Eurocentrism has functioned as a mediation that makes the border between today's standards of humanity. Our interest as decolonial scholar, activist, teachers has been that of exploring the notion of development precisely in its function in articulating the separation between the consumer and the lives of the people and Earth that are being incorporated, dispossessed, extracted, and consumed. Development as the imposition of a worldview, a reality-making principle, and processes that belong to the epistemology of the West and its ontology has meant the acceptance of three main assumptions. The first assumption, as probably all of you know, is the paradigm of economic growth, assumed as the horizon of, for a good life, in contrast with other notions of the plenitude of life, such as summa casada, and many others. The second assumption, anthropocentrism, that is placing the anthropos, the human, in a position of privilege and ownership over the living beings and over Earth. Anthropocentrism is enacted as an epistemology, economy, and politics that bestow the human with the rights and the possibility to consume Earth. Anthropocentrism is realized through individuality and instrumental and networked systems, in contradistinction with relational forms of living. And the third assumption is nature, that is concurrently reduced to be an object for the consumption of the human. Nature is classified as an object of science, is commodified as property of the economy, defined as a resource under the logic of scarcity. In a nutshell, this is the implementation of a relation to nature in which development comes to mean earthlessness, as the loss to the relation to Earth, the loss of the relation to others, and the loss of the notion of the plenitude of life. We could name this loss the coloniality of development. Considering development as articulating the modern colonial divide means considering the question of anthropocentrism, the imposition of Western epistemologies, and the question of earthlessness. I'm sharing with you two images now. On the left, the milpa Apunitierra, Oaxaca, a mix of squash, beans, and corn. And on the right hand, the engraving, Cuando las semillas de la dignidad florecen, when the seeds of dignity bloom. From the collective, produced by the collective autonomous workshop, Grieta Negra Taller. In bringing these images, I want to center on the milpa as a convivial and plurivessel technology that for thousands of years in Mesoamerica has countered monocultives as well as monocultures. Now, let me go a little bit on the decolonial feminist contributions to articulating development as a mediation in the way I'm trying to convene today. Next to development as a concrete historical expression of modernity's control of historical presence through the movements of appropriation and representation, we also want to understand development as a reality-making process that has had effects not only in institutional arrangements and productive processes, which is important but incomplete or partial, but also in the formation of subjectivities. A decolonial feminist engagement with thinking development critically will need to address development as a force of subjective formation, hence as a power that gains access to bodies and that over-determines subjectivities. Building on critical feminist scholars in development studies allows an understanding of development as a force of gendered subjective formation, hence as a power that gains access to feminicized bodies and genderized subjectivities. However, decolonial feminisms are concerned with the coloniality of gender, that is, with how people are reduced to bodies for labor and subsumed under a gender structure that guard the access to socialization, to humanity. Development access to bodies and their harnessing to economic processes cannot be separated from its implications with the coloniality of neoliberalism and the disposability of life for accumulation. Development has been implicated in putting people's bodies, life, and habitats at the disposal of productivity, and rendering disposable, for example, women working in maquiladoras, in bone processing plants, rainforests for the plantation, the mountain and the river for mining and new extractivist economic drives. Decolonial feminisms help us to understand how the enterprise of development is not just a geopolitical economic power that circulates at the level of institutions, but how it is a power that circulates through bodies. Development is then a process that is vividly resisted by women and communities that are struggling for dignity, that are struggling for the radical freedom of living in autonomy and dignity. Now, seeing beyond the critique. From a decolonial perspective, the alternatives to development are not coming from a better adaptation of its discourses of prosperity and humanity, but from the linking from its notion of humanity, from its articulation of the modern colonial divides, and from its anthropocentric disposition to earth. Across the world, some social struggles are already delinking from the paradigm of development, as we heard yesterday in one of the events. The resource war we are facing today is one in which First Nations are struggling to preserve their lands, their water, mountains, dignity, the right to self-determination. The ecological frontiers today coincides with the epistemic human frontier, as the last resources are in First Nation people's land. Copin and Berta Cáceres' struggle to defend the Gualcarque River, Standing Rock Sioux people resisting Dakota Access Pipeline, Samir Flores Soberanes in Amilcingo, Morelos, and many other guardians of the Earth's heart, their struggles cannot be only understood as struggles for the preservation of resources, but I think invite us to also see them as struggles for the preservation of the possibilities of plenitude of life, of being relational forms of worlding the world, of living in dignity and plenitude. The ongoing social and political struggles for autonomy, justice, dignity, and earth of the social majorities of the world cannot be seen only as struggles to access development, or to become development, or resisting development. So let me just now briefly share with you some general characteristics of a particular example that takes a decolonial approach to research. This particular project or intervention was conducted by the University of Amsterdam Diversity Commission. In the spring of 2015, student movements occupied the University of Amsterdam. They demanded the democratization of decision-making in every area of the university. The students of color and their movements raised the demand to decolonize the university with the slogan, "No democratization without decolonization." One of the outcomes of this mobilization was the creation of the Diversity Commission that conducted research from March to September 2016. The Diversity Commission chair was Professor Gloria Berger, one of the most prolific and interesting Black feminists in the Netherlands, and author of the book White Innocence, Paradoxes of Colonialism and Race. I was appointed to this commission with other three members, Rolando Vázquez, Marieke Slootman, and Hans Janssen. As a commission, our mandate emerged from the University of Amsterdam student movement, which was to investigate the state of demographic, but also of knowledge diversity at the University of Amsterdam. The title of our final report is "Let's Do Diversity." In a country like the Netherlands, that is considered an example of egalitarianism, progressive attitude to soft drugs, same-sex marriage, abortion, and for being post-racial and colorblind, to speak about diversity or even decolonization was simply unthinkable some years ago. As a commission, we implemented a novel perspective that combined decolonial thinking and intersectionality. Decolonial thinking allows us to see, on one hand, how the dynamics of power differences, social exclusion and discrimination along the axis of race, gender and geographical and economic inequality in and by universities are connected to the ongoing legacies of colonial history. Intersectionality as a feminist perspective and praxis for social action allow us to see why distinct social positions of individual students and staff determine how they experience the university. For us, the question of diversity included but was not limited to the counting of demographics. So the Commission adopted a multi-level approach to diversity to study demographics in the university, but also within governance structures, emotions and life experiences, and the way of teaching and learning. In order to address the demands raised by the students at the University of Amsterdam, the Commission had to re-signify the term diversity. The decolonization of the university is not just about who is at the university, but also about knowledge practices. In other words, we extended the question of diversity to assess the epistemic practices at the university. More specifically, we look at to what extent knowledge practices lead towards the reduction or the fostering of difference. Translating the question of diversity in terms of knowledge practices that reduce or foster difference gave us a possibility to address the need to transform the politics of knowledge at the university that is so central to decolonization. The task to decolonize the university is then not an ideological position, but an epistemic stance that struggles against the ignorance of monocultural approaches. Under this analysis, Eurocentrism is detached from being an issue of identity to become an epistemic problem, namely the problem of a monocultural approach to knowledge practices, to research, to teaching and learning in the field of development, as in all disciplines and fields hosted by universities as we know them today. In doing this, the University of Amsterdam Diversity Commission already performed a decolonial move in the configuration of its theoretical and methodological framework. The conjunction of intersectionality and decoloniality brought together the tradition of Black feminism and the Latin American modernity coloniality network. One of the oldest universities of Europe, established in 1632, was for the first time evaluated from and with perspectives and methodologies from across the global south, from across the colonial difference, from outside the normative perspectives of Western dominant thought. This was, I believe, a small but significant decolonial move. Let me just wrap up. A decolonial analysis of development cannot be seen in separation from modernity's Eurocentrism, anthropocentrism, and epistemic violence. It is complicit with the expansion and the reduction of Earth to resource and of negating relational forms of world in the world. Development as a powerful representation and world-making process is not a novel idea, but one that has carefully advanced by post-development contributors, as we know. The coloniality of development brings forth the question of how it has functioned to further the erasure of worlds of meaning and the consumption of the human and earth life. A decolonial analysis of development has to look at its power effects, its world-making processes, and its coloniality, that is, its implication in worldliness, or the erasure of other worlds, and in the earthlessness that is the anthropocentric consumption of Earth. Finally, such an analysis has a task to listen to other geogenealogies that can, in their alternative ontologies and temporalities, indicate radical alternatives to development and Western modernity. The colonial thought is oriented towards contextual and grounded alternatives, alternative worlds of meaning. Can we envisage a way out of development to cultivate the possibility of a life in plenitude, of an ethical life that is not implicated in the consumption and suffering of Earth and proximate and distant others? Many thanks.